Hello, and welcome to The Wider Lens, which is exploring how we move from a degenerative system to a system which allows all living things and humanity to thrive and flourish. I'm Jyoti Banerjee. I'm CEO and co-founder of North Star Transition.
Hello, I'm Jenny Scott. I'm a founder partner at Appella Advisors. We're going to be looking at how to change complex systems, and in particular, how to catalyse that change from within society.
So Jenny, we are going to be talking about transition, and we've got a 6-part series here. And I guess we're going to explore issues like, what is a transition anyway? Why do we need a transition? How do you begin to go about a transition? Who needs to be involved? So I guess we're going to be picking up on the conversations you and I have been part of for some time now.
And you mentioned about, what is a transition? I think transition probably means a ton of different things to a ton of different people. So probably the best place to start. What do we mean by transition? And obviously we've been working for a couple of years now on this idea of transition. So it'd be great if you could give an example of what that looks like in real life.
So the complicated thing about a transition is, where do you start? And what does it look like? So let me give you an example of something that we saw out there that illustrates how broken and disconnected the system can feel. So a couple of years ago, I was in a conversation with a farmer from Pembrokeshire in Wales, and he told me he grew brassicas.
So that's like broccoli,
cauliflower, that sort of thing. And in the conversation, it turns out that he binned 60% of his brassicas every year. And for me, the question was, that's crazy. Why on earth would you grow something knowing that you're going to bin it?
So he literally throws away perfectly good cauliflowers.
He throws them away. He actually just runs them back into the soil. So at least his soil gets some benefit from it. But the reason he did it, and my question to him was, is there something wrong? The cauliflower's not big enough. And he said, no, actually, they're too big. Because if you are selling cauliflowers, you need to sell a certain size of cauliflower so that you can fit 6 cauliflowers in a box, because that's what the major supermarket wants. And if you can't fit 6 cauliflowers in the box, you might as well throw them away because you can't sell them to the supermarket. And the crazy thing is, if you can't sell it to the major supermarket, it's quite likely nobody else wants it. So he doesn't even bother. He just goes and bins it.
So I think that's a really great example of the kind of the powerlessness almost of one person who's sitting within this web of a very complex system. So even if the farmer in your example wanted to give the cauliflowers to the local hospital or something, as you said, he probably wouldn't be able to do that because the local hospital is part of a similarly complicated procurement system. So,
well, it's really funny you should talk about a hospital, because my immediate reaction was, why can't the hospitals buy it? Because we also separately work with NHS Wales, and we know that NHS Wales spends 22 million a year on food. And so if there's a chance for them to buy good quality, locally grown
why wouldn't you?
food, why wouldn't
Crazy
you?
not to.
Okay, so it turns out they can't do it. And do you know why? It's because the procurement teams buy food that will match what the dietitians think need to be provided. And the dietitians created a menu which is a seasonal menu. So every season it changes. And that seasonal menu is what determines what food is going to be served to patients.
So if you've got cauliflowers in the field next door to a hospital, but cauliflowers aren't on the menu that month, you have to bin the cauliflowers, right?
Because if the seasonal menu doesn't need cauliflowers in the season, even though that's the season in which they get grown in Wales, you can't use those cauliflowers. So that's the brokenness of the system. Every piece of it is aligned to make sure it works for that bit of the system. But when you put the pieces together, we end up with what we would talk of as being a degenerative system. And to me, a degenerative system could be a system that has a climate emergency, or it has biodiversity failures, or it has flooding, or it has fires, or it has a health inequalities crisis, whatever you want to name it. It's the outworking of exactly the same system.
So in order to fix that system, the logic therefore becomes don't act alone, talk to everybody else who's in different parts of different systems and see if you can figure out where all of the trade-offs are and where all those blockages are and everything. And that's where this idea of a transition lab comes in. So the secret sauce, so from my experience in going to the transition labs and helping North Star think a little bit about what works best and how to conduct those labs. So I think the number one point that I pick up in these labs is the importance of deep listening. So I know in the example of the brassicas, I recall that there was someone from the NHS Trust in that meeting who heard this story and similarly was aghast and thought, this is insane. And he went back to his NHS Trust and told everyone else. And even though he was relatively junior in the finance department, who would think, I haven't got any locus in this whatsoever, what can I do? He started a conversation, which has then started a whole food sourcing program to try and fix this ridiculous problem. So I think deep listening is a really important part of the transition lab. People have to come to the table willing to listen to everybody else. They've got to leave their egos at the door. And also the importance of identifying those breakdowns and failures that you've just talked about, which probably, the finance guy from the NHS probably had absolutely no idea that the farmer growing the cauliflowers in the field next door was binning them because no one had no one had crossed that kind of system boundary before. So identifying those breakdowns and failures, I think, is another really crucial part of a transition lab. So deep listening, breakdowns and failures.
So I would add a couple more components to that. So one, you got to bring people together who often don't even know each other, but they're part of the same system. So if you thought of the system that starts with growing food on a farm and eventually ends up with food on a hospital plate, there are loads of pieces in between. How does the food get off the farm? Who buys it? Who processes it? Who gets it to the hospital? How do they procure it? Who decides what food is going to be fed? All along the way, there are loads and loads of steps. And quite often, the people who are involved in those steps are disconnected from each other. And so we use the phrase disconnected allies, because when you bring these people together who often don't know each other, even though they're part of the same system, they don't know each other, you bring them together and you ask them, what is your vision of how a system could work if it was a good system and it really served everybody and it allowed life to thrive? Then quite often they come up with the same kinds of outcomes. So we think these disconnected allies need to be brought together, because when they come together, they can begin to reimagine how the system could work. Because like the example of the farmer growing brassicas, if the people who are ultimately going to be serving food get the opportunity to serve healthy, fresh brassicas because they've just been grown in the neighboring farm, well, why wouldn't they want to do that? And it helps everybody. And that money that is going to be spent anyway on food by NHS Wales isn't going out of the country. It's serving a local farmer.
So you're kind of creating alignment, aren't you, of people? These disconnected allies are actually creating alignment within the system as opposed to disconnections, I suppose.
Yeah, we have disconnects today. We have failures in the system. And in fact, instead, if we could shift to something that allows those different pieces to work together and to work together for each other's benefit and well-being, then why wouldn't we want to do that? So right now, you could think of the system in the food system in Wales as being one where it grows food that is perhaps not ideally suited for the people who could consume it in Wales. So it's growing it using methods that are not great for the landscape because it's harming the landscape. It ends up polluting the rivers. It ends up being food that means that the farmers are actually not doing well at all. Economically, they're really badly off. And then you need government to step in and provide a subsidy. But while the government is providing what in Wales is £250 million worth of subsidy to farmers, NHS Wales is spending £500 million on sorting out diabetes. in Wales, which is also a food issue, but it's the other side of the food problem, which is what happens once people have consumed it and possibly consumed not such good food tied to bad lifestyle habits, etc. So it's how all these pieces could actually just be reimagined in a different way that could have really positive outcomes.
And the other thing I like about the transition lab model is that it gives people agency. So it's so easy to think, well, I really want to do the right thing and I really want to live in a regenerative system, but what am I going to do? I'm on my own. I am basically powerless, like that farmer. Obviously, that farmer doesn't want to churn his cauliflowers back into the soil, but probably thinking, well, what on earth, how am I going to change this entire system that's built up against me? So I think that would be the sort of what I would think of as the final little bit of secret sauce in the transition lab recipe. So you've got the deep listening, the identifying the breakdowns and the trade-offs. You've got those disconnected allies. You've got alignment as strategies on a much, much bigger scale. And all of that ends up giving more agency to individuals, which is just magic to see when you see it in a lab, isn't it?
And if you think about a problem like the river is polluted,
yeah,
you and I would think, well, what can we do about it?
Yeah.
We might live by a river. We can't change anything because much of what is happening to the river probably happens 200 miles away from us. And then we just live with the consequences of whatever pollution is happening. Can we change anything? Can we change anything about how NHS works? Can we change anything about the climate emergency or the wildfires or the flooding? Well, for most of us, the answer is, well, I can't do anything. Somebody else needs to solve this problem. And sadly, we live in an era where leaders aren't prepared to do the stuff that will address these problems. So instead, we've got to ask ourselves the question, what are we going to do about this? And can we begin to change this stuff? And in the transition labs, what we find is people say, okay, so I can begin to see something that I can do myself that makes a difference. And if I can connect with and align my actions with these other people, we can do something together. But then, of course, the tricky question comes, how do we fund this stuff? Where's the money going to come from to enable these different ideas to take root? And for us in the transition lab, we see that as being absolutely key. We need to find a way in which the wonderful ideas and the actions that are there on the ground can actually begin to align together, but also can be implemented for real because the resources are made.
And I think we're going to definitely come back to the idea of the money, aren't we, at some other points in this conversation and later episodes, because you're right, it's the thing that unlocks everything. When I think about the transition labs and the systemic problems that we've got, I sort of think of it now, having been to a couple of labs, in terms of these sort of two things that you need. It's not enough to have a bunch of well-meaning people who really want to change the system. And equally, that's a sort of kind of cultural heart point, I would guess. And equally, it's not enough to have the means of changing the system if nobody wants to change the system. So what I think we're trying to create in these labs is both bringing together people who really, really have want to change the system and are motivated to do it, and then really critically giving them the tools to unlock the sort of plumbing, the infrastructure that allows them to change the system. The example that I'm completely stealing Chris de Meyer's analogy here, who's one of the colleagues we work with at University College London's climate lab, and he talks about, if you want to take your kids to school on the bus, if there is no bus route, you're going to have to drive because the infrastructure's not there. If there is a bus route, but you actually don't care and you'd quite like your warm car and who cares about the carbon emissions, then you're also going to drive. So what you need is them both. You need both the will to drive, the will to not drive and put your kids on the bus, but also the bus route. And I always think of the transition lab as bringing together both of those elements. It brings together the hearts and minds, but also the kind of the levers and the kind of institutional and the plumbing and all of the hard stuff that goes with it.
And I think if we were to use the example of the bus ride to school, for a number of people, possibly they didn't even know they could use a bus. because that idea wasn't there. Or they didn't think it would be workable because they wouldn't know how to organize a bus, or they wouldn't know who even knows how to drive a bus, or any of those things. I mean, I'm trying to be, in a way, it's being trivial here, but those are the kinds of systemic challenges that prevent people from thinking, okay, let's go and do this thing of driving a bus to school. And instead, when you get people together and realize, actually, the skills are around, we can do this differently. And if we do it differently, the outcomes can look different. That's when things begin to happen.
Yeah, and I think the same thing can be carried across the corporate sector. So I know so we're going to be, in this series, going to be thinking about transitioning a corporate, transitioning a nation. Very, very ambitious, but hey, why not? And transitioning an entire landscape. And we've got examples, and we have each of those where we've tried to do that. And just on the corporate example, because my background is a little bit more corporate to date, albeit in slightly odd sectors like sort of the BBC and the Bank of England. It's not hardcore capitalist, but I have been around a lot of corporates for most of my career. And if I was being kind to them, I would say that they're also constrained by the systems that they operate in. You might look at them and think, well, actually, they created those systems. So it's hard luck. If you created it, you can create something different. And there's definitely something in that. But, these are corporates who are nestled within their own complex systems. Those systems are also battling against things like, at the moment, we've got war, we've got mass migration, huge inequality, all sorts of constraints that corporates have to take account of other than what is a good transition. And the market signals that they would normally listen to in order to, say, motivate. If their customers say, actually, we want green stuff, why aren't you corporates delivering it? Those market systems are being jammed by a complex set of subsidies that aren't exposing the real cost. Who's paying for the pollution and the carbon? If that was incorporated into the cost of things, maybe our choices would be very different because different things would be more expensive. So the point being that when we explore the corporate world and what it takes for them to transition, I am not claiming that they are whiter than white by any means. I'm not claiming that they're saints in all this, but there is a certain element of them bumping up against similar complexities, being trapped by similar systems. So we've all got to come to the table, willing to listen, willing to hear everyone else's points of view, rather than saying, well, it's your fault, nasty corporate, or it's your fault, politician.
Yeah, we're all in it together.
Yeah.
And we can point our fingers as much as we like, and that's not going to make the blindest bit of difference. We need to find a way to bring people together. So in this podcast series, we're going to explore transitions for nations, as you've said. How does an entire nation shift? How would a corporate transition? What would they transition to? And how do they make that happen? How would a landscape transition? But we also want to ask the question, are there tools that help us make this transition? And where will the finance come from? So that's sort of our agenda for the episodes.
So I think we've got our work cut out for us. We're going to start next episode with how to transition a corporate. Yeah?
That's right. And if anyone's interested in what we're doing, they can find us on the web. We're in www.northstartransition.org. We're also on LinkedIn as North Star Transition. We're on Instagram. And of course, send us an email. So we are info@northstartransition.org.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.